Hello, I'm Tam Crocker, and I'm here to talk about the sunbonnet Sues that are in this quilt. The sunbonnet Sue pattern was established way back in the early 1900s. It's still popular today. But these particular sunbonnet Sues, they belong to Mary Boston. And her great-great-aunt Clara made these for her circa 1935. Aunt Clara lived in Michigan. So this was in a different quilt. It was white with pink borders. Looked a lot different. Mary had it for a long time, as you can imagine. Gradually, the sunbonnet Sues migrated off the quilt. She had them in a cupboard or someplace. She's moving into the quinault. She needs to find a home for the sunbonnet Sues, and so she gives them to me. I'm the lucky receiver, but now what do I do with them? So it took a while, but then I decided to put it in this quilt, and the outline here is called the Irish chain. And then you superimpose the sunbonnet Sues on that and sew them on top. That part of it is called applique. So Mary came to take a look at the quilt during the process that I was making it. It was apparent Mary needed her quilt back. So we finished the quilt, and she received it for her 90th birthday. And then to be finished this, here is the label that goes on the quilt. These pink pieces were in the package that Mary gave me. I'm assuming that great-great-aunt Clara cut this pink piece out, but I don't know for sure. So we have the history, and then I bordered it with fabric like as if Mary did have the quilt back then in 1935. So this is a fun quilt. We all enjoy it, and thank you very much.
So my husband couldn't wait to retire. When he worked, he wore nice dress shirts and ties, and he really enjoyed nice ties. And he had them all in a box, and he was ready to pitch them out and donate them. Well, being a quilter, I looked at all that beautiful fabric and decided, well, there's no way he can do that. I was trying to think of a way to put them together into a quilt. And I've seen people where they just sew the ties together and make a skirt out of it or something, but I wanted to do something a little more. So I took all the ties apart, washed them, and then put them together in, separated them out in colorways. So I ended up with two quilts, this one and one that is more beiges. The black on this is velour because I wanted this to be a lap robe that we would really use. And so this got velour on the back too, just so it's cozy. But I just love the colors on that. But I don't think he thinks about work at all when he sees it. And I'm Tam Alden with all the ties that were Tim's.
Hello, I'm Barbara Cook, and for 20 years I worked at the Human Rights Commission in the Evergreen Plaza building, which is right on Capitol Way across from Sylvester Park and next to the Governor House Hotel. And on Monday through Thursday, I would walk around Capitol Lake. On Friday, I took Fridays off, but I would often go across the street to talk to an old friend of mine, Glenn Anderson, who always stood on Fridays from 12:30 to, or from 12 to 1, holding a big peace sign. He was a serious peacenik. And if he had a sign, I would hold a sign with him. If he didn't have a sign, then we would chat and catch up on our news and things like that. And one day he said to me, "You know, Barbie, you really ought to join the Women in Black." And I said, who are they? And they said, well, he said, well, it's a small group of women who stand at the foot of 4th Avenue Bridge on Friday from 5:30 to 6 and hold a silent vigil. And I said, do they all wear black? And he said, yeah, they all wear black. So I said, I can do that. I wouldn't mind doing that. I think I'd like doing that. So the next Friday, I got out every black item of clothing I had and got dressed up. And after work, I went down to the 4th Avenue Bridge and stood with these women. And they stood silently. Some of them I knew, but we didn't talk to each other except to just briefly greet. And I stood for half an hour, and when it was over, I felt really good about myself. I was proud to be with them. I was impressed by them. And so I sort of decided, well, that's what I'll do on Fridays from now on. And this was the end of summer. It was a lovely day in September, and I went back the next week, and it was a lovely day in October. And then the next week was fine. Then there was the week with the downpour on Friday, and I didn't have a black raincoat or a black umbrella, so I thought, I'll skip it. And I felt guilty, but I should mention, we moved here from Honolulu, and I'm weather sensitive. The Friday after that was the first serious frost, and the sidewalks were icy. So I didn't go that Friday either, and I continued to feel guilty, and I told my husband I felt guilty, and he said, well, think about it. So I thought about it over the weekend, and the conclusion I came to was that I'm a fair weather peacenik, and so I never went back. I did learn to quilt, and so this quilt that I made is a tribute to the stalwart all-weather women in black who stand at the foot of the bridge every Friday afternoon at 5:30. And someday I'll probably go back and join them, but I guarantee it will be sunny and dry.
Well, this quilt I made after my mother-in-law passed away. I went through all of our photographs, and it was kind of a grieving process to go through and find the photographs that really reminded me of her. She was a very outgoing, flamboyant lady who had had a very hard life, but I noticed in so many of her pictures she just had a big smile. And so I had fun picking out bright colors and adding a little bit of bling around the edges. I couched some yarn. And this technique is done with just a regular inkjet printer and a special fabric that you just print your photograph onto the fabric. And then you can just sew it like a regular quilt.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Daniels, and I've named my quilt Belize. I'm not a great world traveler, but I've been a few places outside the country. But the greatest trip of my lifetime was a National Geographic expeditionary cruise from Belize to Costa Rica. An expeditionary cruise provides the passengers with biologists, marine biologists, naturalists, photographers, historians, and they point out what you're going to be seeing and help people understand that. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia is the largest in the world, but the Belize Barrier Reef is the second largest in the world, and it stretches from Cancun to Honduras. It is one of the most magnificent natural wonders you ever want to see. It is full of magnificent live coral. And the coral is alive only because the big draft ships can't get in there. The ship we were on was small, had 80 passengers, and afforded us many opportunities to snorkel in this beautiful reef. One of my greatest memories was snorkeling near the Blue Hole of Belize. The Blue Hole of Belize is a giant sinkhole, marine sinkhole, that measures 10,043 feet across and 407 feet deep. This quilt, the colors in this quilt remind me of the Blue Hole of Belize. You start out in the beautiful white sand, light blue waters that become more turquoise as you approach the edge of the blue hole. And when you get to the blue hole, you all automatically feel like you've reached the end of the world and are about to drop off. It turns darkness. It turns to darkness. It was a wonderful, memorable trip. And the stars on this quilt, to me, represent the beautiful nights that we spent where the stars were bright and it felt like you could reach up and touch them. It was my trip of a lifetime.
I'm Jan Gilmore. My mother was a quilter, and I have so many fond memories of spending time with my mom quilting. We were either working on a quilt or shopping for fabric. My mom had a picture of a quilt that she had been wanting to make and called Tennessee Waltz. And so my sister and I took her to a quilt shop to buy the beautiful fabric for this quilt. And she took the fabric home. She's pieced everything by hand and quilted by hand. So she probably took a year or so for her to finish this full-size quilt. When we held the quilt up, my sister and I held it up for her so she could see it at a distance, we could tell she was really unhappy with this quilt. She was convinced that she had done something wrong. It was beautiful, but she just felt like she had done something wrong. What quilters know about quilting is that when you make a quilt block, and this is a Tennessee Waltz quilt block, and this is another block that goes with this same pattern, when you make a block, it'll probably turn out pretty much the way you think it will. But when you put them together, side by side, without a border around each block or what we would call sashing, they can often create a pattern that you don't see at all. You wouldn't have guessed. You would have thought maybe Tennessee, this is a real traditional Tennessee block quilt, you would have thought maybe it would be like stars everywhere. But instead, maybe all you see is this hexagon, or maybe all you see is this curved circle. So I'm pretty sure that's what happened with my mom's quilt. It just did not look like the picture she had, but it wasn't wrong, it was beautiful. So in memory of my mother, I made this Tennessee Waltz quilt. I'm sure if she were alive, she'd say it was a Tennessee Waltz gone terribly wrong. And I have called it, it's not my mother's Tennessee Waltz.
Hi, I'm Lynn Hampton, and this is Jog Your Memory 2020. I love to jog, and I have entered a lot of races, but here is all the things that I use a lot in my races. Of course, my favorite tennis shoes, have to start with those. Most of the time I use a pink hat, baseball cap, and when I get to dress up for the race, I wear a pink tutu. Of course, you keep your time. And my other joke is that I only do these fun runs for the new t-shirts. Listen to good old-fashioned rock and roll. And as everybody comes around the corner, everybody's excited to get to the finish line. And it is great to see people and people cheering. And a lot of times when you finish, you get one of these crazy little medals, just as a participant medal. Now, most of you look down both sides, you'll see that I have a lot of numbers. Those are my actual bib numbers from most of the fun runs that I have done since I've lived here in Panorama. But there is one special bib number because this year, sadly, we had all the races canceled. And so there is a 5K race route here on Panorama campus. And so I decided this spring that I would do the Panorama solo 5K run. And I've done it twice this year. I keep my time. And I hope to do it one more time before the end of the year. But my hope for 2021 is that we get back to having some of these races, because it really is a great opportunity to be with other people and race and the camaraderie. But I also have another reason, and that is I need new t-shirts. So this is Jog Your Memory 2020.
Yeah, hi, I'm Carol Harma, and my quilt is called Road Trip 2005. So obviously it is not a quilt that I just made for this challenge, but it is a testimonial to the fact that the memory power of fabric is strong. In 2005, my husband and I did a trip around the United States in our fifth wheel. It was a slow back road trip, and one of my rules was that we had to stop in every state at a fabric store and buy a piece of fabric. So when we got home at the end of the trip, I had all of these pieces of fabric, and I had to decide what to do with them. So I kept them for a while and came up with this great pattern called Road to California. It's a traditional 9-patch pattern, and the seemed quite appropriate. So one of the things that I notice now and noticed then is that I bought the fabrics according to what the state sort of said to me. And so there is a lot of blue and green on here because there's a lot of, forests and grasslands and water features across the country. And what I've found now is that those blue and green ones have kind of blended into my memory, and the ones that really stand out for me are the others. My very favorite fabric is this one right here, the black hills of South Dakota. There's gold in them there hills. And another favorite is the red sails, which is from Manistee, Michigan, which was a beautiful spot that we stumbled across, and it happens to be where my Swedish great-grandparents ended up when they came to America. Probably the favorite quilt shop that we visited on our trip was in Charleston, South Carolina, which is a very favorite town of mine. This is from Charleston. It was kind of south and whatever-y. Another one that I really like I really remember is the stars, which came from Alpine, Texas, which is quite near the McDonald Observatory, where the stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas. I could talk more about all of these fabrics, but let me just say that I have a cheat sheet. I didn't bring it. I have a cheat sheet that helps me remember where they're all from, because some of them are strong in my memory and some aren't. And that's my quilt.
I'm Judy Lindsay, and this is my quilt called Summit Gardens. I was born and raised in the Canal Zone, but my father did not work on the Panama Canal. He was a tropical botanist, and he was director of a botanical garden. I grew up riding my bicycle and running through absolutely gorgeous tropical gardens. The focal part of the garden was the lily pond. It was always full of lilies, and it had a wonderful stone bridge that went over it. We loved to go there for birthdays and picnics and all kinds of fun gatherings. We were always advised when we were on that bridge to be very, very careful, because in the lily pond was an alligator named Rochester. It seems as if some soldiers in World War II had gone into the Panamanian markets and bought a baby alligator, took it back, and were raising it in the showers. Of course, the alligator grew, and the other men didn't like finding an alligator in their shower, so they had to get rid of it, and they brought it to the gardens, and my dad put it in the pond. Eventually, I grew up, graduated, left the Canal Zone, and never really went back. But my friends went back on visits. And I was talking with one of them once because I thought I might go back and visit, see where I went to school and lived, and of course, go out to the gardens. And I was told, no, you probably need to remember them the way they were. And I wanted to know what that meant. I said, I want to see that stone bridge again. And I was told, well, now it's painted blue. Well, I went right home. I cut the fabric out and I started building this picture. And I got it all done except for Rochester, and I had to wait for my good friend Gail Tracy to go to Hawaii on a trip. And when she came back, she brought me the fabric with an alligator on it. And I finally got Rochester, and the quilt was finished. Now I could look up Summit Gardens on the internet. You don't see that much. It seems to be mostly a little zoo. I don't know how botanical it is. And I really am happy just looking at it and having my good memories.
Hi, I'm Karen Lohr. My quilt is called Crazy COVID Crumbs, and that's because it's made of all the crumbs left over from making many, many masks. The masks themselves were made of leftover fabric from many, many other quilts that I've made. So if you picked up a mask at the end of my driveway, you'll find it here somewhere. The other memories in this quilt are of making many, many quilts for family and friends and charity. Also of delivering masks to Judy Pitt's door, and of finding delightful donations of fabric, t-shirts, and cash on my front door or at the tray at the end of my driveway. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Betsy Olson, and this is a crazy quilt, which is my favorite type of quilt to make. It refers to being crazy because it uses irregular shapes of material, anything that you feel like doing, and interesting little doodads on the quilt. Now, I want you to know that it does not refer to the quilt maker. The quilt maker is just fine. In the late 1800s, quilts, crazy quilts, were the fad. They were influenced by Japanese art and British embroidery. And it ended up with results like this. Any quilt, I didn't use a pattern, it just came about. I had fun. It's filled with memories of our life living in Belgium for 3 years. One of my favorite things was to browse thrift shops, antique shops, and especially local markets. I was very attracted to beautiful buttons, costume jewelry, trim, material, just anything that I fancied. I had no plans to do anything with it. I enjoyed them. And then when we got back to the States, I started making quilts. And I saw a picture of a quilt, and I thought, well, I think of a crazy quilt. I thought that I would try making one. And it was fun going through all my old material, the things that I've collected over the years. And this was the first one I ever made, and it came together. It's actually easy, but it's very time consuming. And I also brought another one, which is a Christmas stocking that's hanging here on the other whatever it is. And so it is a decorative quilt. It is not a useful quilt, It isn't one to cuddle up with, but it's fun to make, easy to do, and has memories galore for me. I hope you enjoy looking at it.
My name is Lucy Reuter, and I title my quilt Memories in Plaid. I made it in memory of my husband Bob, who served in the U.S. Army active duty for 30 years. And when he retired, he decided to become a master gardener, and he decided to landscape our entire yard, and his apparel of choice was a pair of blue jeans and a plaid shirt. So when he died, I had some plaid shirts. So what to do with them? Well, I decided to make it in circles, which represents the circle of his life. And he was a music lover. He loved gospel, so the circle be unbroken. I left the edges raggedy because gardeners have to be a little bit raggedy. The corners, all these red squiggles represent all the moves we did during that 30 years, and then our travels after we retired. The border has little American flags, which represent Uncle Sam, who was our boss for 30 years. The beige background is for the New Mexico desert, because he grew up in Tucumcari, New Mexico. So I was able to make 3 quilts. I made this for myself, and men's shirts have a lot of fabric. So I made one for each of my daughters. So that's my story.
My name is Janet Sears, and my quilt is the Sea Ranch Chapel. This little jewel is located on the Northern California coast, across Highway 1 from the ocean. Almost more a sculpture than a building, it is open all the time as a place of quiet and rest for locals and travelers alike, as well as being used from time to time for intimate weddings, marriage renewal vows, and memorial gatherings. The shape of the building copies the ocean waves, and the roofline echoes a nearby windswept tree. Designed by James Hubble in the 1980s, it was constructed of redwood, cedar, and stained glass, mostly by local craftspersons. I was told by one of the carpenters that they had to work from rough drawings because to figure it out as they went along, because there are no 2 boards in the building that are alike. The chapel symbolizes for me the beauty, the creative energy, and the amazing community spirit I experienced in the almost 20 years I lived there. Bob and I absolutely made the right choice when we decided to relocate to Panorama 11 years ago. I now love the Pacific Northwest, even on a dark, rainy day like today. And I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. This is home. But I will be forever grateful for the years I've spent living on the coast. Maybe it was the natural beauty, the ocean and the redwoods. Maybe it was the welcoming community spirit. Or maybe it was just the right time in my life as I set aside the super organized, efficient self and found a whole new creative side of myself. But something of the spirit I sensed at the Sea Ranch opened up a whole new world for me, and I would not be who I am today without it. The chapel symbolizes that for me and brings back so many happy memories.
Hi there, I'm Rosemary Walrod. I've been sewing since my feet could reach the treadles on my mother's old Singer sewing machine. When the COVID-19 pandemic caused the world to stop doing the activities that we were accustomed to doing, everybody started cleaning out closets and hoarding toilet paper. Well, I did as a lot of folks did. I was cleaning out my quilt and fabric closet, and I came across a quilt that I started maybe 10 years ago. I don't know why I quit. It was about 80% done, but I thought, this is pretty big. If I finish this, I can get a lot out of my closet. This is a sampler quilt. It was designed by Barbara Brackman, a quilt historian. And there are blocks that were designed in as early as Revolutionary times and as late as the 1970s. I found that when I started quilting on this, I somehow began thinking about 80 years ago when I was 6 years old. And it's interesting that at that time we were undergoing a lot of national stress and there was contention going on. And somehow, I think it was because I thought about first grade. I was starting first grade that year, 1940. I was lucky to be able to start because my birthday's on November 1st, and that was the cutoff date. We didn't have kindergarten in those days. I think they thought it was frivolous to have a playtime for students when they should be going to school, and they could hardly afford the schools. So I can remember how thrilling it was. I remember our first grade teacher, Miss Gladys Poe. And every morning we would settle down, we would stand, we'd salute the flag, and we'd say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. And it was very meaningful to us. And then we would sing a song that was made popular. It was written by Irving Berlin, God Bless America. And it was sung by Kate Smith, and she had a way of belting out a song, and we would try to emulate that in our little first grade voices and sing it out as powerfully as we could. I'll digress a minute and tell you a little bit about the quilt and the quilt blocks. This sampler quilt has an interesting feature. If you'll notice, it's all squares and triangles, and that's kind of the basis of patchwork. And by changing the colors, making just alternate, you can see that it changes the nature of the block. So there are actually 2 blocks of every one of these blocks in this quilt. So now I can't find which ones are which, but there's a flower basket, or I think one of the names for this square is Prickly Garden, because somebody thought that looked like a cactus. And this has the red in the top. And here's the same quilt block down here. It has red at the top and blue at the top and the red bottom. So throughout the quilt, you can find a twin for the square, and that makes up the quilts. A very popular figure in quilting is called a 9-patch. And this square is a 9-patch. These are 9 blocks here, and they're made up of little blocks that are also 9-patch, and there's 3 across each one. So a combination of 9-patch blocks within a 9-patch block. You can see one of the classic squares throughout the years. It's called a sawtooth star, and there are different renditions of that. Here's one over here, and the points make it look like a sawtooth around. This is a somewhat modern rendition. This is more of a classic, also a sawtooth star. And you'll see that in many different ways in quilts throughout the years. I'll go back to my 1940 images. In that year, it was a contentious presidential election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented 3rd term. And to us, we were people who worked in mills and in the forest industry. FDR was like God. He'd gotten Social Security. He got the 40-hour work week. Anyway, it just seemed as though he was one of the few politicians who supported unionism. And the Northwest was a very strong union kind of an area. I think the Wobblies started, IWW, International Workers of the World, started in Seattle. And several industries had their own unions. My father worked in a shingle mill. He was called a shingle weaver. But anyway, to have a politician that would support the formation of unions was unique. Anyway, my birthday being November 1st, it's always close to the elections. And my dad being in a labor union and being an organizer was always very sensitive to the political world and into politics and voting. A lot of our neighbors were like first, second generation immigrants, new citizens, and they were very proud of that, and voting was really important to them, and they turned out in droves. Our voting place was kind of a back room in a little grocery store in the neighborhood where they set up booths for the voting, and it kind of was like an all-day potluck party. People would bring food, and you would go, you'd eat, or whatever. I would get a little ballot for a child, and I could put my X in a little box for my candidate, and I'd always get at least a cookie. So it's very strong memories of going to vote with the folks. Anyway, we also like to go on Sunday drives. I don't know, a lot of people went to visit family around the county and so forth. But my dad thought it would be a good thing to get in our old Studebaker and drive up to the Tacoma Narrows, where they had built a big bridge. And the Narrows is very interesting. It's a beautiful stretch, and I hope that everyone gets a chance to visit in that area. But they had built a single-span bridge across the Narrows, quite an engineering feat with the wind and the very strong currents through the Narrows. And so we wanted to go see this new modern engineering feat. Well, we approached it from the west side, and as we came up, it sort of looked like it was moving a little or something, but there were the huge steel cables, and it looked so strong. So we started across, and as we got closer to the middle, you could feel the thing moving. And my dad was struggling to keep the car in his lane, and my mother was getting a little white-faced, and my dad looking grim, and my sister and I in the back seat thought it was just great. We were just bouncing away back there, thinking it was the best thing. Well, that was on a Sunday. On Monday, at school for show and tell, I told about my Sunday exciting venture. On Tuesday was the big election, and that was, I believe, November 5th. FDR was elected to this unprecedented third term, but on Thursday of that week, the bridge fell down. It had earned the name Galloping Gertie, and Galloping Gertie is actually famous worldwide because it changed the way that engineers studied for and built bridges. It made them aware of, I don't remember the term, but the way things will vibrate given the wind currents and so forth that affect the bridge. So we were really excited and happy for FDR, and we are quite devastated that our bridge fell down. So it's interesting, the memory is so vivid in my mind, and yet after that, I don't remember anything about that year. So, but the red, white, and blue, just because of all the things going on with the elections and all, just brought that all back to me so clearly.
Hi, it's me again, Cynthia Daniels. I've named this quilt 1776 to 2016. Some of you may not be aware, but 2016 was the 240th Independence Day for the United States. Numerable individuals have contributed to helping the United States form a more perfect union. In the last 2 years, we've lost 4 of those people who will be missed and will remain in my memory forever. The first of those is Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg spent her entire life fighting for gender equality, civil liberties, civil rights, women's rights, and much more. She'll be missed. Secondly, Senator John McCain, who spent 5.5 years in a North Vietnamese prisoner of war camp and elected to remain with his fellow prisoners rather than go home when the opportunity was offered. He also served honorably as a senator for Arizona. Third was Representative Elijah Cummings, who fought his whole life for civil rights and for the rights of all Americans to have health care affordable. And last but not least, Representative John Lewis, who also spent his life fighting for civil rights, most notably for the right of people of color to vote. In that regard, he marched in Selma and almost lost his life for that reason, but he continued that quest for the rest of his life. In that note, I would like to mention that voter suppression has always been around. However, in the last few years, it's been very blatant and hard to ignore. And possibly that might be a good thing, and maybe we can do something about it. At any rate, I hope we can do something like that, and it would be a great tribute to the legacy of John Lewis.
Hello, Panoramians. I am Becky Sisler, and I moved to this organization, this community, actually, in April of 2019. And I moved from the west side of Olympia, where I had lived for 30 years. However, I have very deep roots in Nebraska, and that's where I grew up. And so the heritage quilt that I want to share with you today is from Nebraska. And this quilt was done by these 2 beautiful ladies. This is my grandmother, Gertrude Otto Scudder, and this is my great-grandmother, both on the maternal side, Flora Ann Berger Scudder, and they together created this trip around the world, my heritage quilt that I love. They created this in Sumner, Nebraska in 1933. So that was the depths of the Depression. And I would just like to say that I consider myself very lucky to have known both of these ladies during my lifetime. I spent my growing up years in Nebraska. Now, as you can imagine, 1933 was a very tough time in Nebraska. My grandmother was coping with 5 busy kids, a husband who was working really hard to try to support his family with farming and cattle raising during the depths of the Dust Bowl. And so they as a family didn't have very many resources in this western Nebraska town during those Depression years. Very small rural community. Also, my grandmother had a special challenge in that her middle daughter, my sweet Aunt Lucille, was a special needs child. She had severe epilepsy, and at the time there were not a lot of medical resources to help with that kind of a situation. Now my Grammy, this beautiful lady, Grammy was a very resourceful and gritty lady. She was an ex-school teacher. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska, and I remember her telling me about her favorite classes: world history, political science, and social studies. So I can imagine her thought processes around the creation of this quilt. In order to cope with her current situation, lots of unknowns during that time frame, and her uncertain life, she saved up her egg money and actually bought all new calico, the 1930s typical calico prints, to put this quilt together. And she launched herself onto her mental trip around the world. She wanted to travel, and she loved to travel, but the situation and the times just would not allow for it. So she sublimated her love of travel and history and world affairs into the creation of this trip. And it was the perfect antidote to snowbound Nebraska winters. After my sweet Aunt Lucille passed away, and also then after World War II, another big challenge, my Grammy did manage to do some traveling. She made it to Canada. She also visited Mexico. She went to the East Coast and saw New York City and Washington, D.C., and she finally made it to San Francisco and the High Sierras, all of which she absolutely loved. Memories, an important part of this expedition. I'd just like to say that memories of my Grammy and Grandma sustain me now during our hard times. Both of them had so much grit and so much courage and so much resilience. And this heritage quilt is just a tangible hug to me of those kinds of values and characteristics. And golly, I do miss them. We are in a hard time now, but I know that this will pass. I have taken up hand quilting and other small handwork projects, nothing of the magnitude of this quilt, but I find that kind of work very rewarding, and it brings me a lot of comfort and a lot of solace. I'm clearly not the quilter that these two ladies are. Just to note, the quilt is comprised of over 14,700 1.5-inch squares of cotton calico fabric. It was machine pieced, but all hand quilted by my Grammy, this lady, my great-grandmother, Grandma, as I call her, and the ladies at the Sumner, Nebraska Baptist Church Quilting Circle. So power to those ladies, and also power to all of the quilters at Panorama. In closing, I just want to say thanks so much to Cynthia Daniels, Catherine Billings, Paul, for putting together this great event. It's been a lot of fun. So a tip of the hat to all of the organizers. Thank you very much.
This Panorama Quilt Challenge was filmed using social distancing. The project was approved by Panorama's Reopening Task Force.
And my sister passed it on to me for safekeeping because one day she came home. She still lives in Nebraska. She came home to find that her husband had taken this to his fish camp.
Oh my God. Okay.
So she rescued it, laundered it very carefully.